What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing. And where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. We're very happy today to have Ruth Whitman, the author of the recent book, America the Anxious, How Our Pursuit of Happiness is Creating a Nation of Nervous Wrecks, published by St. Martin's Press in 2016. So welcome, Ruth.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you on because David and I have been, plus other friends of ours have been, somewhat critical of the mindfulness movement, hence the title of our podcast, The Mindful Cranks.
Right.
So when I read your book, I said, wow, there's so many remarkable parallels in terms of our concerns. And so we're just really, really thrilled to have you on.
Yeah. Oh, well, no, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So I think we could just jump right in. I mean, what led you to write this book? What was the impetus? That's probably a good way to start.
Yeah, so as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British, and my husband and I, with our baby son, we moved to California about 5 years ago, and it became really obvious pretty quickly that there seemed to be this almost obsession amongst the people that we were meeting, our new American friends, with this whole idea of finding happiness, with pursuing happiness, and with almost the idea that happiness should come naturally or should be a byproduct of life or should be a sort of incidental part of life just didn't really seem to be the case here. It seemed to be this idea that you should really work to become happy, that you should improve yourself and improve your life and really, try lots of things to become happier. Mm-hmm. And it seemed in real contrast to the situation back in the UK. And it was quite noticeable. So this really kind of piqued my interest. I kept on having all these conversations with different people about happiness and all the different things that they were doing to try to become happier, whether that was, different self-help books or different positive psychology techniques like gratitude journals or positive thinking. Mindfulness was a huge one. I mean, I had literally never heard the word mindfulness before moving to the States. And then suddenly my gynecologist is talking about, mindful dishwashing. And I'm thinking, is this really the answer?
Yeah, and it's interesting, even you bring it up right in the beginning of the book, that Americans are investing the most money in happiness, positive psychology, mindfulness, but their level of happiness from the world point of view is not that great.
It's pretty low.
Exactly. I mean, this was what really piqued my curiosity. I was kind of thinking, okay, people are trying so hard to become happier here and investing so much time and money and emotional energy. By rights, people in America should be the happiest people on the planet, if all this stuff is working.
Right.
But when you look at the research, actually, these international comparison studies, which, and we can talk about this later, they have their problems themselves. So, this isn't a perfect guide. But still, America falls really far down the list of developed countries when it comes to happiness. People pretty much everywhere else in Europe, in other industrialized countries are happier than they are in the US. And the US leads the way in the world by quite a wide margin on anxiety. So people living in the United States are more likely to suffer clinical symptoms of anxiety than people anywhere else on the planet.
Yeah, it's quite a paradox then. I mean, contradiction. And
right.
You say, I'll quote you here. You say, we have a happiness-seeking culture is clearly supposed to be part of the solution, but perhaps it's actually part of the problem.
Right.
So that
was exactly what I wanted to explore when I was writing the book. I mean, as you say, there's a paradox here. People are trying very, very hard to become happier, but yet they're some of the most anxious and least happy people in the developed world. So I just wanted to know why, which way is the cause and effect going? Is it that people here are already very unhappy, so they have to try much harder than everyone else to become happier? Or is there something about the search itself which is leading to part of the anxiety, which is actually causing some of these problems. And I think there is good evidence to show that both of these things are true, that the causation flows both ways.
Right. I think we've seen many types of programs or techniques come and go over the years. Really goes quite far back historically. I mean, even beyond and before the self-help movement came into being. But I think what you touched on was some common element in terms of that this quest is seen as some private, personal, individualistic journey, and I think you really elaborate on that quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things one of the most important things that I found, that I think here in America, and I think this is very deep-seated cultural expectation, that people do see happiness as something that you pursue as your kind of private, individual, personal journey, that, you read the right books, that you think the right thoughts almost, the popularity of the positive thinking movement, and now the mindfulness movement. It's, one person on their own just trying to think better thoughts and, to try and make themselves become happier. And there's no sense that happiness is related to your circumstance, that, it's just a kind of result of whatever your life happens to be like. There's this idea that it's an internal psychological process that you can have a lot of control over and that you can affect. And I think this comes with two big problems. I mean, one is that I think this view of happiness is something that we do essentially on our own, a kind of individualistic journey, really flies in the face of what we know about how happiness actually works. I mean, we know all the evidence points to the fact that happiness is about social connection and community and other people. That's the single biggest factor affecting our happiness. And so this idea that we should be sitting on our own in a dark room, reading a self-help book or thinking mindful thoughts or, doing positive thinking exercises really kind of flies in the face of that. And I think then there's a wider problem about not really engaging with the actual problems of society. If you see happiness as an individual thing that's divorced from circumstances, it can lead to a kind of very solipsistic view that doesn't really take social justice into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another trope that you hit the nail on the head with was that as you started reading all these books on happiness and mindfulness, they kept saying that it's not other people. As you said, you use the term emotional isolationism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing. You see all these memes on Facebook and things which say, happiness doesn't come from other people. Happiness is an inside job. And actually, that really is the complete opposite of what happiness actually is. Happiness does come from other people, that other people are the single biggest source of our happiness, whether that's our friends and family or our wider communities and our engagement with the wider world. So it's a very odd attitude, this whole, you can't find happiness from other people. And I think a lot of the recent trends in happiness seeking, as it were, in the self-help movement, meditation and mindfulness is a huge one. I mean, meditation is essentially about sitting on your own, either on your own or in a group, but in complete silence, and each person having a very private emotional experience.
You're not even supposed to look at people's eyes in some of these
right,
retreats,
you're not,
right?
Yeah, and the whole thing is about detachment, getting rid of attachments and unhealthy attachments. And people go on these silent meditation retreats where absolutely they'll be away for 2 weeks and no eye contact, no talking. And, I as part of my research for America the Anxious for the book, I didn't actually do a residential retreat, but I did various meditation courses. And it's almost embarrassing to talk to people. I remember going into a meditation session and being embarrassed to ask anybody where the bathroom was because you feel like, I'm just intruding on their private spiritual space. And if you think about that in contrast to the way that people used to explore spirituality, through traditional religious communities, these have their problems too. Mm-hmm. But at least it's a basically social engagement, but church or synagogue or mosque or the rest of it is basically a social event. And these I say newer, they're actually kind of founded on ancient wisdom, but have taken a new turn. But yeah, they're essentially, yes, as you said, emotional isolationism. It's a big part of it.
Yeah, and it's curious because, as you say in the book, that Americans are extremely lonely. They're suffering from tremendous loneliness.
Yeah.
And yet their pursuit is to stay isolated. So it's very strange.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of research that shows that Americans are becoming increasingly socially isolated, that communities are breaking down, that I think the statistic is that 1 in 4 people doesn't have a single person that they could confide a personal problem to at the moment. And loneliness, I mean, increases our risk of premature death on a similar level to smoking. Mm-hmm. And about twice that of obesity. It's not just dangerous to our happiness, it's incredibly dangerous to our health. So you would think that anyone in the happiness business would just be saying, get out there, socialize, be part of your community. But actually they're saying almost the complete opposite.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of what we've been up against in the mindfulness movement, so-called mindfulness revolution.
Right.
And our critiques have been exactly along the same lines as just how privatized secular mindfulness programs have become. I mean, that's in very stark contrast to some of the more traditional Buddhist communities where the notion of Sangha, the community, is as important as meditation. So that's something
that's really interesting. Yeah.
It's an intrinsic part of the mindfulness from the Buddhist tradition.
Right, it's the community,
And there's 2 other aspects of being sociable. I mean, one is simply, as you pointed out, just being with people and having friends and being connected. But the other missing part that comes from the wisdom traditions and probably from research is the idea of that it's not just about me. In other words, about giving to other people, providing service, which again is part of Buddhism and other communities, but it's just not mentioned anymore. Happiness is. There's a distinction we talk about between hedonism and the Greek word eudaimonia. And hedonism is really kind of all very self-centered, as you described, and the eudaimonia has kind of disappeared. The idea of service and giving to other people.
Right, absolutely, which ultimately leads to a happier, more meaningful life. But I mean, I think what you've hit the nail right on the head. I mean, the kind of commercialization of mindfulness has stripped it of its most essential things. It's become this very neutered, very apolitical, this idea that it really is all about just focusing on whatever's right in front of your nose right at the moment and giving it this excessive, laser beam focus. So, you see all these instructions, get a raisin and stare at it for 20 minutes. And, I mean, really, is that really who we want to be as a society? Is that really what we need to focus on at this time, at this particular political and cultural moment when there's, so much suffering and distress in the world? Do we really want to waste our best minds, staring at raisins?
That's the kind of question we ask.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it a lot in Silicon Valley. We live in just near San Francisco. Well, we live in Berkeley, just near San Francisco, but my husband works in Silicon Valley, and there's, we see a lot of this culture. And it's so popular in Silicon Valley culture, this mindfulness and meditation, all of these kind of quasi-spiritual pursuits. But absolutely, it's become this very solipsistic, very commercialized thing. And the idea really behind it is to make you more productive at work, to make you work longer hours, to make you focus, to make more money for corporations, ultimately.
Yeah, you even mentioned in the beginning of that chapter where you start talking about corporations that you actually attended Wisdom 2.0 conference.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, so I went to this conference, Wisdom 2.0. They have it every year. And I mean, some of the wealthiest people in the world are there. There's extremely wealthy tech entrepreneurs who go to talk about the meaning of wisdom. I say that in air quotes because, I mean, and really wisdom in this context, they've defined to mean mindfulness and a particular type of mindfulness, which is your phrase, to use your phrase, which is a brilliant phrase. And I mean, this thing was just, it was the excesses and kind of slightly ludicrous nature of this place. I remember one of the, not the one that I went to, but one of the Wisdom 2.0 conferences actually had protesters break in and say,
yes,
this is ruining our city,
right.
Tech money is causing a housing crisis, all the rest of it. And in this kind of bubble of mindfulness, people, that it was almost like they completely ignored and refused to engage with those issues.
Let's just return to our breath, right?
Right, exactly. Let's talk about our breath and our focusing on the sounds in the room or whatever. And I mean, that just sums up, I think, the attitude that's going on here in the modern mindfulness movement.
And as a plug, Ron and I wrote about that very conference. I think it was 2014. It's in the
you did?
Post. Yes.
Fantastic.
So we know just what you're talking about. We couldn't believe it. It's incredible.
And some of the things, I write about it in the book. I mean, some of them are almost comical, the scenes that I saw. I was just kind of ridiculous. And usually, when I'm writing stuff, I really have to think about, how am I going to portray this to make it interesting and funny and, all the rest of it. But there I literally was just transcribing what people said. I sat there with my computer and just transcribed word for word what everybody said. And the result was so ludicrous. And so, I read these, that's the chapter that I often read the most when I do readings and events, and people just can't believe that the kinds of things I was writing were actually real quotes from people, but absolutely they were.
And there was a mindfulness trade show attached to that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of, they might not call it exactly a trade show, but at the conference, there's out in the hallway, there's everybody there with their leaflets advertising their, luxury yoga retreats and their luxury mindfulness retreats and their mindful books and, these kinds of things. I mean, this is a huge industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, the mindfulness industry. And, I think it's very much focused on a wealthy, elite clientele and completely disengaged from the problems of the wider world. I mean, it's talking about being aware, but it really is a kind of awareness which is so clueless, it's hard to really fathom.
Very narrow focus.
Yeah, I was stunned to learn that, I knew the mindfulness industry was at about $4 billion, but I was stunned when I read that in your book that the yoga industry is up to $10 billion a year now.
Yeah, I mean, extraordinary. And, I'm less critical of yoga in a way than I am of the mindfulness movement because I think that yoga is something that people do for their health. It can feel quite good in your body. I think people do it as a form of exercise. I think it doesn't necessarily have to have a wider philosophy attached to it. And so I think it's less problematic. I think mindfulness tends to fall into the same trap as much of the self-help industry, which is this very neoliberal idea that, you can fix your own problems by fixing your thoughts. Don't change your life or don't change the world. Change your own attitude towards the world.
Right. Societal problems are nothing but a thought disease, a thinking disease.
Exactly. And you see this, in the UK as well, from where I come from, you see mindfulness programs. They've been introduced into schools, into low-income communities, into workplaces, and it almost feels that people cannot raise the actual concerns of their lives because they'll just be told to be more mindful. The problem isn't that, you've got a terrible job with a lousy paycheck and no paid vacation and you're exhausted because you're doing the work of 3 people. The problem is that you're not being mindful enough.
Right, and as you point out, that ties in with the neoliberal ideology that's shared in both the UK and here.
Yes.
The NHS has adopted mindfulness as a cost-saving device. Westminster came out with a report about it. I know some people there that they're using it in schools.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the Lady Bird Book of Mindfulness, the parody.
Oh yes, that's brilliant.
So it is already becoming an item there. And,
right, there's a kind of a backlash as well. But yeah, and I mean, in the UK, there's some of the most egregious examples of all of this because, it's mindfulness, it's also positive thinking. Our previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, he was very influenced by the positive psychology movement and the work of Martin Seligman. And he set up all of these positive thinking things in job centres. Is that what you call them here? Employment centres, where the unemployed would have to go on these positive thinking courses in order to claim their welfare payments, and with the threat of being cut off from their payments if they don't go and change their attitude. And you read first-hand accounts of these things, and it's really quite sinister that somebody would try and to suggest that the reason that they're not finding a job is because there are no jobs and because the state has been stripped back, that services for mental health have been cut to the point where it's just completely untenable for people to get services. People will try and raise any of this, and the coach will be saying, well, you're just, your problem is that you're too negative. You're not being positive enough, and, threatening people with losing their money. And, bullying people into positive thinking really doesn't sound like something that's going to lead people to become more psychologically healthy.
No,
yeah,
they just become more depressed, I think.
Right, exactly. It's gaslighting people. It really is. It's just...
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
It's like the
really exist.
It's like the new mantra is like you have to take responsibility for your own happiness. And
yes.
The story.
Yes. I don't know if you've seen these memes and things, posters that say happiness is a choice.
Right.
If you really break down what that means, it's so deeply offensive.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that you're unhappy because you're not somehow working hard enough or making the choice to be happy, is just completely dismissive of people's real problems. And you see this, it's not just the kind of popular self-help movement and the kind of hucksters and the motivational speakers. It's also the academics at Harvard and at the University of Pennsylvania. It's the prestigious elite universities which are pushing out exactly the same message, in a slightly more, respectable format. But the basic philosophy is the same.
Well, and you really drive it home in the book, and this has been a really big pet peeve of mine, is the big elephant in the room is just how much money's involved in these programs, even among academics. Academics are out there becoming consultants, but they're also bringing in tremendous amount of money in grant funds.
Yeah. It's true, because the positive psychology, the academic positive psychology movement has a major sponsor, which is the Templeton Foundation. And although the Templeton Foundation itself claims to be politically neutral, its founder was Sir Don Templeton Jr., who was a major, major right-wing donor. He donated millions of dollars to the Republican Party, to right-wing political causes, small government causes. He was an evangelical Christian, anti-gay marriage, socially conservative. And he is the one, or his foundation is the one that has provided the money for the grant money for academic positive psychology. So even if the projects they fund are politically neutral in one sense, they've kind of set the terms of the debate. So what they don't study is the impact of social justice or income or race relations or these sorts of things on happiness. And what they do study are, these tiny little interventions like, what does it mean if you write a gratitude journal every day? And can we find a benefit? Or count your blessings studies or mindfulness studies. And you find these things that make tiny, tiny difference possibly in a lab setting, or maybe don't. They massively exaggerate the findings. And then they go and sell them off on all of these, coaching and apps and books and all the rest of it. There's a huge conflict of interest right at the heart of it.
Right.
I was surprised at how you uncovered a lot of that, the kind of research that really was suspect, and really dug into that.
Yeah. I started looking at some of these studies because, they would make these huge claims like, there's this pie chart. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's very popular in the positive psychology circles. Mm-hmm. And it shows, how much of your happiness comes from which, from what things. And it's got one section which is your circumstances. So, what the things that are beyond your control. And in this pie chart, it shows just this tiny sliver of 10% that is accounted for your circumstances. And then this huge section of the pie chart, which is devoted to things you can control, the part of your happiness which is under your control. So I started digging around to try and find out whether this was actually true. And you look at the research that this is based on. It's decades old. It really doesn't say what they're claiming it says at all. There's a huge range of different estimates within that research. They've taken the absolute lowest thing. I mean, it's just such a manipulation of what the evidence really shows, put out there as if it's complete, indisputable fact. And similarly with the studies, you read these things saying studies show that writing a gratitude journal can increase your happiness by a huge amount, or mindfulness can increase your happiness by a huge amount. You go back and look at the actual academic papers that show this. You look at the data, and I had help from Dr. James Coyne, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Pennsylvania, fantastically intelligent and impressive scientist. And you realise that these figures have just been completely manipulated. And these so-called huge findings are often either completely non-existent or sort of massaged to the point where they're really meaningless.
And you got Seligman to admit that one of his studies wasn't actually published.
Yeah, I mean, there was this one thing, it was quoted in somebody else's book saying, this amazing study that shows that, people with severe depression would just write down 3 good things that happened that day for a period of time. And by the end, their depression had lifted or become, gone from severe to mild or whatever. I thought, wow, this sounds incredible. This could save the health service worldwide billions, in treatment and medication, all the rest of it. I tried to track down the study. I couldn't find it anywhere. It's listed in footnotes. It just doesn't exist. I eventually emailed Martin Seligman, who was supposed to have conducted the study, and he just wrote this one-line email back, which said, I never published it.
Right.
Okay,
yeah, I mean,
why did you not publish it?
Yeah, we've seen the same phenomena when it comes to mindfulness research. It's overhyped. It's positive reporting bias.
Yes.
And many of the researchers are also teachers and trainers.
So there's a big conflict of interest there, absolutely.
Right. You have experimenter allegiance to even some of the studies.
Right, absolutely. I quoted in my New York Times piece, I quoted a meta-analysis that was done a couple of years ago looking at meditation and mindfulness techniques. They looked at 18,000 citations of studies about these techniques, and only 46 studies could be included in the meta-analysis because they were of high enough quality to even be included in the analysis. The other ones, the remaining 17,000 or whatever were just of low quality, had no control groups or the rest of it. Of those 46, they showed really no difference between mindfulness and any other relaxation technique or breathing exercises or spiritual audio tapes or all the rest of it. But still, even the abstract of the study is quite misleading. And then the way it was reported in the press and the way that this thing gets this juggernaut of support, it just really doesn't match up with the reality of the evidence.
Yeah. And you mentioned, when you mentioned Professor Coyne,
yes,
that, it takes a lot of courage to challenge the mainstream narrative. And, I think some people that stand up and speak out against some of this hype and everything, they're kind of ostracized and marginalized.
Yes, absolutely. And he told me stories. I interviewed him for the book, and he told me stories about being blocked from these positive psychology online communities, from message boards. He submitted papers which reanalyzed data that from certain high-profile studies showing that the results actually weren't as clear as they said, and wasn't able to find anyone to publish them. He says it's a very closed shop with everybody scratching each other's backs, and people don't like criticism.
No. Yeah. We find the same issue with mindfulness. Yeah, and people get very defensive, and they say, well, it worked for me, or never mind all this.
And great, and I am not saying in any way, if people want to be mindful or think it helps them or relaxes them or makes their lives better in whatever way, then great, go for it. This is really not me trying to control what other people think about, of course. Everyone should do. And, I have heard many people say to me, I find this very helpful. And to which I say, great, that's wonderful if it's working and it's helpful to you. But that doesn't mean that it should be introduced on a wide scale, that public money should be spent on it without sufficient evidence, that we should be making claims that just aren't justified by the research.
Yes, and also that there's a need to look at where the other money's coming from as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to take this back a little bit again to the corporation, and there's some interesting parallels in your book between some of our observations. But You actually spent some time at Zappos, the company in Nevada.
Yeah. So Zappos is a shoe company. They sell shoes online and a few other things as well. And their CEO, Tony Hsieh, is extremely influenced by positive psychology and the happiness agenda. And he wants to make his company and his customers the happiest people in the world. So you go to this company and their offices are just full of balloon animals and stuffed llamas and parades and parties and, all of these things, which to a British person can be kind of quite cringe-inducing. But, some people enjoy, some people don't. That's a matter of personal taste. But you start to sort of dig into this thing. And, I interviewed the human resources director there. And she basically seemed to be saying, well, there's a couple of things. One is this idea that, all your happiness should be coming from your workplace and that your boss has a sort of interest and a legitimate interest in your emotional state. And that sort of socializing outside of work and your time outside of your working hours should be the property somehow of your boss as well. So being part of this company culture, they talk about being, a cultural fit. So being a cultural fit means doing a lot of socializing outside of work with your colleagues, obviously unpaid, going out drinking, doing all of this, which is very hard on a lot of people who have families, who have other things to be doing. It's a slightly sinister view of the workplace in my mind, that they should be up all of your time and all of your energy. And then there was this idea that, if you're somehow not a cultural fit, even if you're performing well in your job, that they can fire you on that basis.
Was he the bloke that said that if I don't feel like having a drink with you, then you're not, even though you pass all the good qualities of being an employee?
Then we won't hire you. And I think this, on the face of it, I think probably everybody hires people that they warm to and they like. But there's something quite sinister in that, because a cultural fit means somebody like me. And I think it's a real problem for diversity, people who are different, who don't quite fit in, who don't, want to play the same sports or drink the same or, do the same as the drinking thing is a huge thing. What does that mean for people who, for religious or cultural or personal reasons, don't want to go out drinking? Does that mean you can't get a job? You might be the best person for the job. And they told me this outright. They say you could be the absolute best person for the job in terms of your qualifications and your performance. But if I don't want to get a beer with you, then you're out. And same for when you've already got the job. If you prove not to be a cultural fit, then they can get rid of you on that criteria at any moment. And I think it's not just Zappos. This idea of cultural fit is a thing that's spreading across corporate America. And I think it leads to this. In certain ways, it can lead to a real old boys culture, into a kind of, it really favors young white men.
Very homogenizing.
Very homogenizing, people who have a lot of time and money and whatever to go out drinking, and that's what they want to be doing. And I think, it really is a problem for diversity.
I think
that was kind of an interesting experience.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the scary parts about Zappos was just this tremendous social pressure to put on a happy face. It's like emotional labor or something.
Yes, absolutely. If when you walk into the lobby of that building, there is a giant cutout of the CEO holding a big sign saying, delivering happiness. And there's this constant message about the importance of your happiness to company objectives. How do you're having a bad day, you're going through a divorce, you're going through a crisis, a bereavement, or you're just naturally not a particularly happy person. The pressure of that is anxiety-inducing. And then for the also in the book, I visit this, it's kind of an offshoot of Zappos in a way. The same guy, Tony Hsieh, actually bought up 40 acres, I think maybe 40 acres, I could have got that wrong, 60 acres or something of land in downtown Vegas. Buildings, businesses, everything, called it the Downtown Project, and was running it on similar principles. He shipped in entrepreneurs from all over the country. He funded them with his own money, and was this same thing, that he was funding people with this idea of cultural fit. And he wanted to sort of start up this happiness utopia within this little community to bring the principles that he tried at Zappos to a wider scheme. Mm-hmm. And it was a fascinating and kind of chilling place in lots of ways. I spent some time there, interviewed lots of people. But one of the things, without saying too much about it, is that in this so-called happiness community, they started to have this horrifying spate of suicides of young people, caused in part, people have suggested, by this constant pressure to be happy, to put on a happy front and never to admit to your real emotions or fears or feelings of, and to be feeling under pressure to do this in a very, very public environment. It was a really interesting and quite frightening experience.
Yeah, especially when you're sort of deceived into thinking everybody else is happy but you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of our problems more generally as a culture. I mean, I think social media plays into this as well, that we have set collectively a very, very high bar for how happy we're kind of somehow supposed to be. And our expectations of how happy we can be or should be have really risen. We see on social media everybody's highlights of everybody looking incredibly happy all the time, and it can be a very isolating experience. It's almost that we've lost the ability to acknowledge negative emotions and the part that they play.
Yeah, that's very. Yeah, when you were mentioning Facebook in the book, and you even went there and sort of toured around and everything. But, when you talk about social comparisons and Facebook envy and things like that, it reminded me of it's like a personalized fake news or something.
Right, it is. That's a really good way of putting it.
It's branding. I mean, everybody's into personal branding. It's impression management. It's promoting oneself.
Yeah, the self is an entrepreneur. The self has to become an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and
right.
That's neoliberal ideology.
Yes, absolutely. And that feeds into a lot of things. And I think the currency of social media, or at least Facebook and Instagram, is happiness. It's making yourself look to the world as blissfully happy as you possibly can, and selecting, the 1 millisecond where your kid is not whining or crying or whatever, and putting it on the, taking a blissful photo and making this look like your day-to-day reality. And I think, and, this marketing of the self, I mean, that feeds into a culture where people don't really have employment stability anymore. So, you are the product somehow, that, you've got to farm yourself out to, the pressure's on you to make yourself more employable rather than, on your employer to provide you with employment.
And even when you are employed, there's this pervasive phenomenon of employee disengagement.
Right.
I don't know if you saw that Gallup poll that made this huge estimate of how much money is being lost with employees that are disengaged. So,
interesting. I didn't see that.
Yeah, I've heard many mindfulness consultants and trainers cite that study, and they say, well, guess what the answer is? Mindfulness.
Be more mindfulness. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And but employers are no longer feel any responsibility to address the basic needs of the workforce, so paid vacation, healthcare, a living wage, these sorts of things, and shift the burden right back onto the employee to be more mindful or positive or whatever it is, And I mean, vacation, that's a huge thing over here. I mean, so many jobs either don't offer paid vacation or are so snooty about their employees actually taking them off on the offer that it's almost like a pressure that you can't take your own vacation. I mean, that is a American cultural thing, which is just insane. You see it a little bit in the UK, but maybe not as badly as here.
Yeah, there's actually a pride in people who just work 80 hours a week and don't take holidays here.
Yes, absolutely. And then you see, these companies like we talked about with Zappos or Facebook, where, you've got a dentist, a dry cleaner, or whatever, a doctor, a video games arcade, a meditation coach, all of this in your actual workplace. So why go home? There's this real blurring of the lines between work and leisure and self and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think that one of the key things that you also bring up in the book is this idea of competitive happiness. It's almost like this we're posturing, we're spin doctoring, going back to what we were just saying.
With social media.
Yeah, I mean, social media has really kind of brought, I think there's always been a slight tendency of people to do that, but this social media, I think, has just launched it into the stratosphere that, that who can be the happiest and who can look the happiest. And, and it's this feeling. And, I'm completely guilty of it myself, that, you're having a happy experience. And at the same time, in the back of your mind, you're sort of thinking about taking a photo of that happy experience to see how it was going to play on Facebook to your friends,
Oh, yeah. That's
ridiculous.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
No, I was...
Well, one of the things that I think we all have in common, what we have in common, is just how much even academics are colluding with this in so many ways.
Yeah.
And, there's some sort of underlying political philosophy or that's sort of connecting all the dots here.
Yes. One thing that I would say, I was at a conference, an academic conference, a few weeks ago, and I met some academics who were studying the phenomenon of happiness from an economic point of view and not from a positive psychology point of view. So there's sort of two disciplines that really focus on academic research into happiness. And I think they come up with totally different results and from totally different starting points. And there was an economist called Carol Graham. Her work is fantastic, and she works with the Brookings Institute. And she looked at happiness amongst white males. And her research, you might have read about it in the press, but it's looking at how, poor white male happiness is declining while everyone else's is raising. And the interesting, there are many interesting things about this that for another conversation, but what struck me was that, far from this claim in positive psychology that your circumstances don't matter at all and that whoever you are and whatever your place in the world is irrelevant and it's just a kind of internal psychological process. The research, which I believe to be much more rigorous coming out of economics and sociology, really shows a quite different picture.
Well, yeah, that's...
So I'm Paul academics in together on this.
No, and that's becoming a better known fact. The Times wrote about that a few months ago, and I almost feel like the culture can't quite absorb that. It's the idea that white working class men are dying because of unemployment and drugs and despair.
Absolutely, yeah. And imagine going into one of those communities with all of those problems and saying, okay, guys, what you need is to just be more mindful or write a gratitude journal. You'd be laughed out of town. And so I think this insistence that circumstances don't matter to happiness is just, it's bordering on offensive, really.
And I think those people are squeezed by a lot of people on top with power that then get them to think, well, I've got to make it on my own, because then they're taught to look at people who can't make it on their own and get government on the dole or on welfare, and so they resent them, and so they say, well, that reinforces the individualism, and it reinforces the need that they have to make it on their own.
Absolutely, and it's shaming people, for.
If you don't mind, I'd like to read a really quick passage here. I think that's relevant to what we're talking about.
Sure.
It says, "Ever since I first dipped my toe into the world of consumer happiness industry, I have struggled with this basic narrative, with its almost belligerent denial that structural obstacles to happiness exist. It seems to promote a dangerous level of social and political disengagement about tackling the injustices of the wider world." I think that was, that's just a beautiful sentence.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's the substance is just powerful. What you just said.
Nails it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I do believe that. I think that this continual insistence that happiness is not about circumstance, it's about effort, really does encourage us to just completely ignore the realities of social justice and, the things that need to be done out there.
Yeah, I'd like to end maybe with a question, and you do actually ask this question at the end of the book too. Is that, well, what's the harm in positive psychology or mindfulness? Why critique it? That's what people have criticized us for. Is like, well, why are you are you critiquing something so wholesome as mindfulness practice? And it's like, well, no, that's not what we're saying. That's
yes.
not
I mean,
a point.
I think, I said in the book, sometimes when you pick a fight with positive psychology, it kind of feels like you're picking a fight with a fridge magnet. I mean, how it's just like so anodyne, what are you actually fighting against? And also, this very reasonable idea that people say, well, this makes me feel happy, so why are you attacking it? But I think, and I want to make it clear that, if people find these things helpful, then they should be doing them. If people find mindfulness or positive thinking or whatever benefits them, then that's great. And this is not criticizing those people. But I think these narratives in and of themselves, which deny other narratives that could come up and which promote this kind of neoliberal view that it's all about the individual and that we need to make it on our own and happiness is about, changing your attitude and not changing your circumstances. I think those are, positive psychology is very deceptive in the sense that it sounds anodyne, but actually when you dig down into what's going on, there's something quite sinister there and quite damaging.
Yeah, especially as you mentioned earlier, it starts to become public policy, and
yes.
A friend of ours in the UK just emailed me the other day saying that the Oxford Centre for Mindfulness just received like £6 million from the.
And this is at a time when the UK is absolutely stripping back the welfare state, the NHS. If there was buckets of money and everybody had enough, when they take away mental health services, genuine mental health services for people, and then pour 6 million into a mindfulness institute or whatever, or into promoting mindfulness in schools at the same time that they're taking money away from education and from low-income communities. There's only so much money to go around, and, it's taking money from other more worthwhile things.
Yes, yeah. Well, Ruth, I think maybe we'll come to a close, and I just want to say you're truly a crank, and so you're part of the Mindful Cranks Club.
I'm honored. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And would you like to give out your website for our listeners? You have a great website.
So it's www.Ruth Whitman, and that's got 2 P's in the middle, ruthwhitman.com, and my book is called America the Anxious. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
You have been listening to episode 8 with Ruth Whitman. Ruth is an author, journalist, and a documentary filmmaker from London who's now living in the USA. Ruth's humorous essays and comment pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian, The Independent, The Huffington Post, Glamour Magazine, and The Pool, amongst other places. She is a regular contributor to TheTimes.com and a blogger for The Huffington Post. She is the author of America the Anxious, How Our Pursuit of Happiness is Creating a Nation of Nervous Wrecks, published by St. Martin's Press. Before becoming a full-time writer, Ruth was a producer and director at the BBC, making numerous documentaries and current affairs shows for the BBC television. Be sure to check out our website, mindfulcranks.com, our Facebook page, and you can also find us on Twitter. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Cranks.